I was staying at an Airbnb in a nearby city. This was more than 3 years ago, and while it wasn't absolutely necessary for me to rent an Airbnb for the night, I had a potentially important job interview in the morning and didn't want to drive 3 hours at dawn and then follow up with an interview. I drove over at 4 p.m. and arrived around 7. The house was in a nice neighborhood, and it looked like any other city street with family-sized homes. I parked in the driveway and went inside, almost stopping my heart when a woman appeared around the corner and introduced herself. I didn't expect to see anyone in the house, so I had to collect myself before responding. She explained that she was staying here for a few days with the other half of the house and decided to introduce herself to avoid awkward situations. I had no idea it was a shared rental, so I returned the favor and introduced myself before heading to my room. I took my phone out of my pocket and opened the Airbnb app to see if I had made a mistake or if this was a shady scam. But before I could take a closer look, the woman approached my door and resumed her conversation with me. She asked a lot of questions about me and was just trying to keep the small talk going, so I tried to signal that I wasn't interested in talking right now, but she didn't seem to notice. If I didn't know better, I would assume she was flirting with me. To me. It felt strange because I had only just arrived and it was late in the day, so I was obviously tired. After a few minutes, she left and I had time to check the app. Nowhere does it mention multiple rooms for rent. It simply stated that the house was for rent. However, because the pictures only showed one room, they did not provide a complete answer to my question. I texted the owner asking about it, but I was already here and didn't have time or energy to make additional arrangements. At that point, all I hoped for was a partial refund. After getting my bags into my room, I went into the kitchen to prepare some of the food I had purchased on the way to the rental. After less than a minute, the woman returned and met me in the kitchen. I hadn't taken one until now. Take a look at her, though. She was older, probably in her mid-40s, with tired eyes and messy hair. She appeared to have just awoken or had been awake for an extended period of time. She started another conversation, asking me about myself and telling me about herself, and it became clear that she was flirting with me. I was only in my early 20s, so this was strange and not something I enjoyed. I didn't want to be rude, especially since we'd be staying here together, but I became increasingly uncomfortable as the conversation progressed. She began to smile more and asked if I wanted to see her. Room was very pushy about it, even though I insisted on just eating my food. Going to bed. As I continued to deny, her smile faded into a frown, frustrated by my lack of interest. Just as things were getting creepy, my phone rang on the counter. I looked at it and felt my stomach tighten. The owner texted me, saying no one else should be there and to call the cops if anyone was inside. I returned my gaze to the woman, who maintained a distasteful expression, and then I heard a door open down the hallway, followed by heavy footsteps charging through the house. I dropped everything and dashed for the door, noticing a man in the corner of my eye running toward me as I exited the house and dashed for my car, getting out as quickly as I could. When authorities arrived, the man and woman were nowhere to be found. What would have happened if I had followed the woman into the room is unknown. Fortunately, my belongings that I had left behind were still there, but this only makes me more concerned about their intentions. During a road trip this year, I stayed at 2 Airbnbs. Both were just overnight stops for me to rest, not much to enjoy. I drove 10 hours from my house to the first Airbnb, which was located in a small town in the middle of nowhere. When I arrived, I didn't expect it to be as small as it was, with only 30 or 40 homes, a single grocery store, and a few other markets in the center. I pulled into the Airbnb's driveway. It was listed as a single-bedroom home, and the pictures were nice, except that they never showed the outside of the house, which I could understand. It was old and probably hadn't had any exterior work done since it was built. All that mattered was the inside. But seeing that did not raise my hopes. I got out of my car and took my bag from the trunk, and as I approached the front door, I felt something strange. I paused and listened, hearing complete silence throughout the town. It was late, so it was probably normal to be quiet at this time, but I'd never been to a town this small before, and even at night, most places have some sort of noise, but there was none here. I went up to the door, opened the lockbox, and inserted the key, only to discover that the door was already unlocked. I slowly opened it and called out to see if anyone was home. I didn't hear anyone, and the inside appeared to be empty with the lights turned off, so I went in and locked the door behind me. The first thing I did was walk around the house to make sure everything was fine. The interior was much nicer than the exterior, and the door was left unlocked. I assumed it was a simple error because there were no other indications of anything unusual. I went to bed 15 minutes after arriving, knowing I had to get up in less than 8 hours to drive. I fell asleep quickly but awoke several hours later. I was exhausted and only half awake, wondering why I had even awoken. When I turned to check the time on my phone, I heard something from outside the room. It was a dull thump, as if something had hit the wall. I jumped out of bed and gazed at the door with wide open eyes. The sound had stopped, but I slowly opened the door to check. The hall was empty. There's nothing on the walls either, to demonstrate the thump that I heard. I stepped down, turned off the lights, and looked around the corner into the living room. A man sat on the couch, facing away from me, staring forward into the dark room. My stomach dropped and I froze up as I watched him sit there motionless, as if he was unconcerned about being in someone else's home. I walked carefully and quietly back to my room, locked myself in, and called the cops. Being so far away, I sat in the corner of the room in silence for an hour, waiting for the officers to arrive. During that hour, I didn't hear a single sound outside the room, not even a footstep or thump. However, when the police arrived and looked around, the man was gone. The front door was unlocked, which was the only sign of his presence. After the officers left, I continued my road trip, not wanting to spend any more time in that town. The Airbnb host issued me a refund and remained in contact with the police regarding the incident. But I stopped receiving updates after a few days. I'm not sure if I'll ever find out what happened that night. I'm with a good friend. Zach, we are going to a mutual friend's wedding in Wyoming. They chose to marry in the small town where they grew up, which was inconvenient for others. But who am I to say? Zach and I discovered a nice Airbnb nearby and drove his car across several states to the heart of Wyoming. This town was primarily made up of farms, with a small central area for groceries, food, and a few small businesses. On the outskirts, we discovered the Airbnb. We expected a farmhouse, but the amount of land surrounding it surprised us. Looking in any direction, the only things visible were grass, trees, and a dirt road. Leading here, we unloaded and unpacked our luggage inside. That was nice. I wouldn't say it's particularly attractive, but it was adequate for a couple of nights. Zach and I spent the rest of the day hanging out and talking before going to bed at 11. It took me a while to fall asleep. I believe it was because the house was so far away. It just made me feel uneasy. When I did fall asleep, however, I slept fairly well. We went to the wedding in the morning and stayed there all day, not returning to the Airbnb until at least 9 or 10. Zach went straight to bed, but I stayed in the living room to relax for a while. But only 10 minutes after settling in, a single, quiet knock came from the front door. I got up, but I was very uncomfortable with someone being here so late at night. I walked over to the door to see who was there, but there was no one. I opened the door and stuck my head out to look around. The driveway was empty, and I couldn't see anyone outside. After a few moments, I closed the door. I looked over at Zach's room and realized he must have already passed out, so he probably didn't hear anything. I assumed it was just the house making a knocking sound. It was only one quiet sound, so everything pointed to it being nothing. I sat down to continue resting, but not even a minute later, a quiet noise came from outside the house. This time, though, it came from the other side of the house. I quickly stood up and dashed over to the back, turning on the outside light and peering out the window. However, there was nothing. This only reinforces the notion that the noises were caused by the house, but it does not diminish the unsettling nature of the situation. I stayed by the window for a while. I don't know, maybe 5 minutes, looking out into the backyard that led to the forest, which was now pitch black. I hoped that seeing nothing would calm me down, but it only made me more nervous. There was something about being out here at someone else's farmhouse that made me uncomfortable. I stayed up for a little longer, just to make sure nothing else was going on, before deciding to try my hand at getting some sleep. I went to my room, which was across the hall from Zach's, and got into bed. Hearing nothing else, I gradually fell asleep. When I awoke, I heard a knock on my bedroom door. "Hello, Zachary," I called out. To my relief, I heard Zach's voice in the hall, asking me to come out for a second. After taking one look at him, I stood up and approached him in the hallway. I knew there was something wrong. He appeared terrified and worried. "What's happening?" I asked. He stated that he awoke to something moving outside his window, and when he moved the curtains, he saw the back of a man walking around the house. As we were talking about the situation, clicking sounds started coming from the front door. We both ran over to the living room. A man stood on the porch, his body against the door. He was clearly fidgeting with something, so I knew he was trying to pick the lock. I turned and looked at Zach, terrified, and I believe he knew what was going on without me saying anything. He dashed to his room and called the cops, while I remained outside and made certain that this guy outside did not gain entry. The only thing I could do was hold the lock and hope he didn't deactivate it somehow. I could hear the man becoming frustrated, and then he dashed off to the side of the house. We were both too scared to check the windows, so we locked ourselves in one of the rooms and waited for the cops to arrive. To be honest, the rest of what happened was rather uneventful. Cops arrived a long time later, collecting very little evidence and never finding any leads on what happened that night. I'm not sure who that guy was or why he was attempting to break into the Airbnb, but if the noises I heard earlier in the night were from him, he had been stalking the house for several hours and was aware that he was breaking into an occupied home, making the whole situation even more terrifying.